Okay, so let's start by defining what is SSO. SSO is an identity solution that allows users to use the same set of credentials for accessing and using multiple applications and services. Let's look at an example. Imagine in this scenario, we have a user who wants to use Microsoft Office Suite, Salesforce, and any other business application that you may want them to use. Without SSO, this user must individually log in to each one of these applications. Now, there are two different scenarios here. One scenario is if each of those applications have their own identity sources, which means your user must register their username and password for each one of them and retain and manage multiple different usernames and passwords for all of the applications. Another situation is if all of these are reading usernames and passwords from the same identity source. Now, the challenge that you will have is if this user leaves the organization. Okay. Okay, so let's start by setting Okay, so we're going to talk about SSO and how it works. Let's start by defining what it is, which is an identity solution that allows users to use the same set of credentials for accessing multiple services and applications. Imagine in a scenario that we have a user who wants to log into Office 365, Salesforce, and some of the other business applications. Without SSO, the user must log into each one of these applications individually and also must retain multiple different usernames and passwords for accessing all of those applications. Now, this introduces two different impacts. One of them is user experience impact, which is not a good experience for the user. The other one is a security risk. And that impact and risk of that security aspect of... Let's go back. Okay, so let's talk about SSO, what it is and how it works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about what is SSO, then I will show you what are the main components of any SSO solution, and then we see how users are authenticated step by step using multiple different examples. First, let's start by defining SSO. SSO is an identity solution that allows users to use the same set of credentials across multiple different applications and services. Let's see an example. Imagine this user who wants to access Office 365, Salesforce, and some of the other business applications. Without SSO, the user must log into each application individually. Also, the other challenge here is that user may have to retain different usernames and passwords because each of these applications may use a different identity source. Now, imagine another scenario where this user leaves the organization or moves to another role and you want to limit their access to some of these applications. You have to individually go to each application and disable the user or remove the user or modify their level of access, which is a security risk. However, if you use SSO, you can use the same credential for accessing all of these applications. This also means not only the user requires to manage and maintain one single credential, but also if the user moves out of organization or moves to another role, you can manage their access from the same identity source. Which means with SSO, you can also improve security and user experience. So with that, let's see the 5 components of any single sign-on solution. These 5 components are shared across any solution, regardless of what protocol you use or what technology you use. The first component is the service consumer. The service consumer can be a user, an application, service, or a device that is going to connect to and use your SSO integrated applications and services. The second component is your set of SSO compatible applications. Could be something like Microsoft Office 365 or Google Workspace or Workday or Salesforce or any other business applications that is SSO compatible, and you want to allow the users to log into it and use it using SSO. The third component is SSO enabled identity provider, or IDP. And this identity provider can authenticate and authorize your users, and also is compatible with SSO protocols and can integrate to applications using SSO protocols. Example of these type of solutions are Microsoft Entra ID, Okta, Clerk, or any other application like Auth0, Jump Cloud. There are many different identity providers that can provide this sort of capability. The next component is SSO protocol. There are two protocols that are widely used in industry for implementing SSO. One of these protocols is SAML, and one of them is OpenID. From high-level view, they do follow the same type of process for authenticating the users. One of the main differences between the two protocols is that SAML uses an XML format for providing information back from identity provider to the application or service, which is called SAML assertion. OpenID instead uses a JSON format with REST called WJT token. That's one of the main differences between the two. We don't get into a lot of detailed comparison of the two protocols, but if you want, let me know and I will create a detailed version of OpenID and SAML comparison video. Now, the next component is the SSO configuration. SSO configuration is the component that brings all of these others together and let your SSO solution to operate. Let's look at an example. In this scenario, we're using SSO, using SAML. However, the same principle will apply when you implement the SSO using OpenID. That being said, some detailed implementations of the protocols and SSO configurations are application specific and specific to each identity provider and application that you want to integrate with it. We don't worry about those. We want to look at how they work in principle. So in this scenario, let's say the user opens the browser, goes to portal.office.com and try to log into Office 365. Let's say they use the jim.smith@example.com. As part of your implementation and integration of Office 365 with your identity provider for SSO, now Office 365 knows who is your identity provider for example.com domain. So once Office 365 receives that request, it will return a message or reply back to the user's browser known as SAML authentication request, or SAR. Informs the browser that, or the user, that we need to authenticate you before we can give you access. Now, the user's browser forwards that request to the identity provider. Identity provider then provides information to the users to identify them, to ask the user to provide information to authenticate them. So let's say in that case, if our authentication mechanism is username and password, user is given a username and password field or login form to provide the information. User provides the credentials. After validating the credentials, assuming the credentials is correct, then the identity provider generates SAML assertion token for Office 365, which is an XML format, encrypted and signed by identity provider. Now here, one thing that you need to pay attention to is that this SAML assertion is generated for Office 365. We get into detailed configuration of what is in that XML file and what are different statements that SAML supports or OpenID supports in a separate topic. So once the user's browser receives the SAML assertion token, it forwards that token to the application. Now application verifies that assertion to ensure it's valid, it's signed and issued by the correct identity provider. Once the SAML assertion is verified, user is now given access to the application. Now in the next scenario, what we are going to see is that same user already logged into Office 365 now tries to log into Salesforce. In this case, once the user tries to log into Salesforce, similar to the first scenario, now Salesforce returns the SAR or SAML authentication request. The user forwards the request back to the authentication provider or IDP, identity provider. In that case, because the user already logged in and the identity provider already authenticated the user, it doesn't ask user for username and password again. Instead, it generates the SAML assertion token, but this time for Salesforce, provides the assertion token back to the user's browser. User forwards the assertion token to Salesforce. Salesforce verifies the assertion token and provides the user with access based on what is in the SAML assertion. Now, the same user is going to access the third application. Again, users try to access the application. Application returns the SAML authentication request. The request is forwarded to the identity provider. Identity provider then generates the SAML assertion based on application 3. Now, again, here what we see is because the user already logged in and the session is still valid, the identity provider is not authenticating the user again. That improves the user experience as well. Now, user provides the assertion token back to the application, and the application verifies the token and provides user access to the application. That's how it works. Now, OpenID follows the same set of principles and processes in terms of authenticating the users and providing them with, instead of assertion token, providing them with WJT token that user can present to the application. Now, on the next slide, what we are going to do is we're going to see a summary comparison of different authentication protocols. As you can see, some of them support SSO, some of them do not support SSO. And one more thing I want you to remember regarding this is that OpenID is based on auth protocol. And if you don't know what is auth protocol, imagine if you were using some of the tools, like, for instance, the tools that used for scheduling your social media posts on Twitter, Twitter, it was using auth through, on Twitter, for instance. Then if you remember, when you try to do the integration, there's a pop-up comes up from Twitter or X nowadays. You must provide username and password and then authorize that application. Social media post scheduling application must be authorized by you to use your Twitter or X account. This is the type of activities called authorization. As you can see, auth2 was used for authorization, and this is why we cannot use it alone for SSO, because SSO requires protocols that can authenticate the user. That's why SAML and OpenID are widely used for implementing SSO, but we cannot use auth2 alone for implementing SSO. That brings us to the end of this video. I will also create a detailed article about these protocols there and do a detailed comparison of each one of them. I'll put the link in the description, and let me know if you want any other topics in this area to be covered. I'll be more than happy to do so. Thank you.